Welcome to the Demystifying the Conduct of Clinical Trials in Canada conference call. My name is Johnny, and I will be your operator for today's call. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Later, we will conduct a question-and-answer session. During the question-and-answer session, if you have a question, please press star, then 1 on your touchtone phone. Please note that this conference is being recorded. Today's presenters are Paul Sidney, Senior Director, Compliance and Regulatory Affairs at Altasciences, and Dr. Beatrice Setnik, Chief Scientific Officer at Altasciences. I will now turn the call over to Beatrice Setnik. Beatrice, you may begin.
Thank you. We'll be learning several things about conducting clinical trials in Canada today. We'll talk about the ease of study startup and conduct of trials. We'll also talk about the strategic benefits and why it is beneficial to conduct or consider conducting your clinical trials in Canada. We'll also cover the nuances and details of the regulatory process for initiating clinical trials in Canada. So why Canada? There are many advantages as a country site for clinical trials. First of all, Canada is north of the US, the ease of access. We have a dedication to high quality research in accordance with ICH standards, and easy access in highly populated cities to research subjects. We have strategic data collection that we'll discuss a little later on. And there are also budgetary and timeline efficiencies that make it very attractive to consider Canada as a clinical site location. Also, with our streamlined regulatory and ethics submissions, enables you to have a quick and efficient pathway to study startup. Canada also offers a convenient location. Being aligned with the US in terms of the time zones, it enables sponsors to have quick and easy travel access to monitor studies on site. With communication in similar time zones, it enables us to be a central location that has easy time zone access for communications with our US counterparts, and as well as our sponsors in Europe, as well as Asia and other time zones. Canada offers high quality studies. We are in accordance with the International Conference on Harmonization, ICH guidelines. We have very efficient review processes and very frequent approvals and reviews by central IRBs. We are compliant with Health Canada, FDA, EMA, and other country requirements for robust and study integrity trials. We are also a trusted partner for clinical studies. If you look at clinicaltrials.gov, as of February 2020, over 6,000 clinical trials were active in Canada. Hence, Canada is an active researcher and contributor to global trials worldwide. Canada contains major cities. Our Montreal population, for example, in 2020, has a population of 4,221,000 persons. We have cities with large population access. In addition, with being in large cities, there is affordable and easy transit systems that enable subjects to come for frequent visits to the clinics. We have extensive hospital networks located near our clinics. We also have a very ethnically diverse population. As you can see here on the figure on the right-hand side, the various multiple percentages of multiple ethnic origins in Canada from a 2016 survey. 41.1% of the population reported multiple ethnic origins. This enables diversity and extensive study of different ethnic groups in clinical trials to evaluate the safety, pharmacokinetic profiles of a drug. We also have universal access to continued health care, which ensures that subjects departing from clinical trials also have continued health care. We're also able to accelerate early phase research. And this is a strategy that some sponsors will take. As they're filing an IND in the United States, oftentimes the IND is comprised of preclinical information only. Since clinical trials in Canada do not require an IND to be open in the US, because we have our own independent clinical trial application process, many sponsors choose to go outside of the US to conduct early clinical trials and provide clinical trial data as part of their IND submission. There are advantages of doing this. In addition to having preclinical data, the sponsor is also able to present early clinical data and have more informed discussions with the FDA about their safety and their proposed clinical development plans. There are also time and cost savings for early phase 1 work in Canada that can be considered, particularly in the early days of drug development. Coming to Canada also offers budgetary and timeline efficiencies. Health Canada has an efficient review of a 30-day default period. For bioequivalent studies, there's a rapid target review of 7 days. These study startup activities and Health Canada reviews are conducted in parallel to the ethics reviews. IRBs have very frequent reviews 3 times per week. This enables for very quick review and approval for study startups. As I mentioned earlier, our clinics are located in a populous city, and therefore this enables us to have extensive databases of subjects, enabling rapid recruitment for a clinical trial. In addition, considering Canada, there's often a very favorable currency exchange rate and the potential for eligible clients to receive tax credits for conducting research and trials in Canada. All of these considerations are advantageous for considering Canada as a partnering site for your clinical trial research. Now I will hand it over to my colleague Paul to discuss the regulatory considerations of starting studies in Canada.
Thanks, Beatrice, for the great overview of the active clinical research environment in Canada. As you noted, I'll be focusing on the regulatory considerations when conducting clinical trials in Canada. I will open by addressing frequent questions posed by our clients when planning a Canadian clinical trial, with us to answer some common regulatory concerns or misunderstandings of this drug development strategy. Many of our clients are US-based companies, and so I thought there'd be a value in comparing US IND to the Canadian CTA submission process. Comparison, I hope, will provide a perspective as to how CTA processes may facilitate US and international submissions. Finally, I will share how Altasciences regulatory affairs team services and experience can support clients through each stage of the CTA preparation and oversight, and provide a very high-level overview of the CTA milestones, preparation, submission, and management. This slide, as I said, I'll be focusing on some of the common questions that are raised when we open up discussions with our sponsors. The first question typically posed is, if we do phase 1 studies in Canada, will they be acceptable by the US FDA in support of IND, 505(b)(2) filings, or ANDA regulatory pathways? Or do we need to do any additional bridging studies in the USA? The FDA regulations permit the use of foreign clinical trials in support of an IND or market application. Specifically, Title 21 CFR Part 314.106 is providing that permission, and it's written directly in law. Altasciences is routinely and successfully audited by international health authorities, confirming our compliance to GCP regulations, which addresses the other requirement for foreign clinical trials, which is to meet regulation Title 21 CFR Part 312.120. FDA has published an excellent guidance detailing their acceptance of foreign trials. Most of the studies conducted, in fact, at our Canadian sites are in support of an NDA and ANDA submission. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in subsequent slides. Next question is, what type of documentation is needed to initiate a clinical study in Canada? If you have the documents ready to support your IND, the CTA process will be straightforward. The ICHM series guidance requirements is expected for both the IND and CTA submissions. The CTA submission is structured to gain approval for a single clinical trial, which makes the deliverables lighter than an IND submission. And equally so, I'll talk a little bit more of that in future slides, but it is one of the points to consider in your drug development strategy. The next question, what are the typical review timelines once we submit the CTA? Health Canada guidance regulations state that CTAs are reviewed and approved within a 30-day default period upon receipt of the acknowledgement letter that they issue after initial screening review of your filing. Typically, this is received within 48 to 72 hours following that submission. However, there have been changes recently published by Health Canada to address the challenges, as we all know, of the COVID-19 pandemic. For COVID-19 therapies, the CTA approval process has been expedited. Health Canada interim order has committed to reviewing a CTA submission within 14 days. Health Canada is providing expedited pre-consultation phone calls for these types of therapies within a week of submitting the pre-consultation request and documentation. In contrast, to accommodate the challenge of the increased number of COVID therapies, the Minister of Health has issued a notice advising researchers submitting a CTA for non-COVID therapies that clinical trial review time has been extended by 15 days to ensure there is no default on a CTA review. This ministerial order will be in effect until November 16, 2020, and is not an automatic extension, but affords additional time to the reviewing office to ensure there's no default on the filing and to address any risk of a possible second wave or an uptick in workload within Health Canada. Another frequent question is, will Altasciences take care of the CTA submissions, or do we need other Canadian representation for submissions? Altasciences can handle the entire CTA process on your behalf, and you do not need a Canadian representative to complete these tasks for you. We can complete these tasks for you. This is a routine process for us. We successfully submit more than 128 CTA filings each year. Also, I will provide more information on Reg Affairs Services on this topic, providing a perspective on the point that I've raised on how we can help you with your CTA filing. The next question, after completion of our phase 1 study, do we need to submit a clinical study report to Canadian regulatory authorities? You don't need to submit a clinical study report to Health Canada. Health Canada does not review clinical study reports for therapeutics not intended for submission to Canada. This highlights how conducting Canadian trials does not add work in your drug submission strategy. If your intention is to submit to the US or to other international authorities. It provides you a clear path for running your trial and using that data for your subsequent filing either in the EMA or US. Do we need to update the product development status to Canadian regulatory authorities on a regular basis? For example, protocol amendments, annual reports, etc. During the conduct of the trial and until study completion, Altasciences will update Health Canada of any changes brought to the proposed protocol via a CTA amendment or notification process, clearly detailed in their guidance, depending on the nature of the change. Upon study completion, we will inform Health Canada at the end of the trial, and there is no requirement to submit an annual report to Health Canada, which also highlights, and I'll mention it in a subsequent slide, why this in fact makes this drug development strategy a lighter process than an IND filing. Next question that comes up quite frequently, does the product labeling have to meet the language requirements of Canada? This is an international requirement, and Canadian Food and Drug Regulation, as with any country, requires that the official language of the countries must be included on a drug product label. In the case of Canada, it's English and French. This will not be an additional burden for you should you place the work in Altasciences because of the processes developed by our clinical pharmacy. Upon receipt of the investigational product, bulk containers are labeled by the pharmacy staff to fully comply with the labeling regulations, thus adding no additional work on your team when you commence the trial. Another question, is it true that Health Canada CTA is complex, slow, and inefficient compared to the submission processes in the US or Europe? No, in fact, it's the opposite. When the process is properly understood and the sponsor or the representatives have established contacts with Health Canada, the clinical trial application in Canada is relatively simple, as is the review process. The submission structure is also simple and is limited to the clinical trial listed in the CTA for approval. Health Canada oversees the process and is very supportive of the research, fielding questions by email or phone calls. They share their expertise and guide the clinical research team through the process, and their guidance documents are very clear and detailed, addressing many of the scenarios. If there is uncertainty, a reviewer officer will assist. Altasciences Regulatory Affairs team is in daily contact with Health Canada and has well-established effective stakeholder relationship with the CTA reviewer team. As noted earlier, Altasciences Regulatory Affairs team has years of experience filing CTAs and can assist sponsors in their application. And I have a slide subsequent to this that provides some data that clearly demonstrates that experience. As noted earlier, I've included a CTA versus IND comparison table to highlight similarities of the process, which highlights that the preparation of an IND or CTA, because both agencies follow ICH guidance, eliminates the need to modify the content. There are minor format differences. Walking through the table, for instance, the principle, as I mentioned earlier, as noted, the CTA submission is per trial, whereas the IND for the overall product development program is set for the overall product development, which is a clear example as to why the CTA process is a lighter work effort. And that's one of the points that is often considered for a company when they're developing their drug strategy. The next key item, review time. In non-pandemic times, it's the same as IND review time. The review process is similar, with the differences. If the FDA issues a clinical hold, it could be for an undetermined period of time, whereas by trial, it's much more discrete in Canada. CTA content and IND content, the key difference to highlight in this comparison topic is the fact that Health Canada, unlike FDA, does not require non-clinical pharmacology and toxicology reports to be submitted. Merely a summary of the results of those studies are included in your filing, and that meets the needs of the reviewing officer at Health Canada. And as I noted earlier, an annual report is not required for Health Canada's CTA filing. In this slide, basically an overview at US IND in Canada. No IND is required in Canada. Sponsors are not required to have an open IND to conduct a study in Canada, as I noted. First-in-human patient studies can be conducted following quickly from the non-clinical safety research, based on the fact that Health Canada does not require the final report to be submitted in the CTA submission. This means speed to the market, flexibility, and lower costs without compromising quality or the ethics of a clinical trial. Canadian study output meets global FDA and EMA standards, and as I noted earlier, and as supported by data maintained by Altasciences in subsequent slide, Canadian studies are used to support international regulatory applications, US, FDA, EMA, and other areas throughout the world. You can start quickly in Canada. It's a streamlined strategy. Canadian clinical trials are looked at in favor by clients in their drug development strategies. Primarily, companies may want to initiate safety and proof of concept studies without the substantial investment efforts required to file an IND in the USA. Health Canada reviews and comments on aspects of the study design, endpoints, and subject safety on each clinical trial submitted, whether phase 1 safety or proof of concept, which also facilitates a better understanding of what would be expected by receiving authorities, and allows you to build out and expand your strategy as you progress through phase 1, 2, and 3. And as I will mention, it's very much an iterative process. Sponsors are exposed to a level of regulatory scrutiny prior to these IND submissions, which can assist clients in their US submission. And finally, the resulting studies can be used in support, as I've said, not only for IND, but in the case of the 505(b)(2) pathway, you could move directly to an NDA filing solely through your foreign clinical trial studies. So once again, I guess I'm repeating myself here, but just to hammer home the point with regards to the drug development strategy, it's a stepwise, integrated, iterative process that provides sponsors regulatory feedback, as noted earlier, for each clinical trial. CTA documentation deliverables are focused on the goals and safety per trial, and Health Canada provides valuable feedback during the review period to ensure clinical trials support the international submissions. As I noted earlier, we do maintain Altasciences data on the filings, our particular findings, and as I noted earlier, Canadian clinical trials are successfully submitted in the US, EMA, and internationally, and we have been successfully audited by health authorities in Canada and US and other international authorities, all demonstrating, as I noted earlier, it meets the expectations of GCP, which is what all international authorities are looking for, and therefore facilitates a smooth transition to any other drug development filing, and assurance that a receiving authority will accept the Health Canada study. Health Canada international reputation ensures clinical trials will be accepted. Health Canada is well recognized and respected regulatory body, and you can see they're actively involved in a lot of the global efforts for the pandemic. They actually have participation in the ICFAM International Monitoring Group, overseeing all the various COVID therapies, and which further demonstrates their place internationally in our pharmaceutical community. They adhere to international regulatory standards. As I've mentioned, ICH is the default for Canada, as it is with EMA and USA and others. The good performance on meeting deadlines is demonstrated, and there's that transparency, as I've shared with you. They've issued interim orders, highlighting the fact that they're much more aggressively pursuing COVID therapies and making sure that the turnaround time is within a couple of weeks, thus meeting the needs of community to ensure these therapies get on the market as promptly as possible, and their transparency to the community of having to ensure that they don't default on a CTA, even though they will likely not use the 45 days that they flagged, that they're being very transparent, saying that there may be this requirement. So I think that actually is a clear demonstration of the openness and attention that Health Canada places to its stakeholders. They're firm but flexible approach and non-adversarial, partners with the stakeholders is very much something that's appreciated certainly by ourselves and our sponsors. This graph here highlights our experience. As I've mentioned earlier, the presentation, we collate this data to address what we have done with respect to the number of phase 1 studies as a percentage of the total number of clinical trials approved by Health Canada. We represent approximately 30% of the overall CTAs submitted to Health Canada, which is a clear demonstration of Altasciences Reg Affairs Department's competency in CTA submissions, and it also highlights that we have constant interaction with Health Canada and are kept current with their thinking and any guidances that may be influencing the filing and CTA submission. We maintain a 99% successful CTA submission rate, which further highlights the experience that we maintain at Altasciences. This last slide is very, very high level. I'm sure many of the people on the call are aware of this process, but just briefly I'll go through what is clearly detailed in guidances by the agency. Essentially, the process commences with a CTA submission filing of the ICH M1, M2 package, which are primarily summaries of non-clinical, preclinical, the QOS or quality overall summary. This is submitted and a screening process is established, and typically, as I mentioned earlier, takes place in about 24 to at the most 72 hours post-submission, at which point, if everything meets the reviewing office's expectations, an acknowledgement letter will be issued, and the 30-day review time period will commence. The review is typically a parallel review process with both the clinical group and the quality or chemistry review team specialists in Health Canada looking at the filing. Subsequent, Health Canada may issue information requests as that 30-day period progresses, should they require any clarification or points within the submission documents that have been provided. And the sponsor and Altasciences have 2 days to respond to those queries. If the CTA submission is deemed acceptable, the final stage is to receive a no objection letter, which then allows you to initiate a clinical trial, import the investigational product, and commence the work effort, the research. One point I do want to highlight as well, there is administrative guidance that for bioequivalency studies, although the loss is 30 days, very often the processing of a BE study is very much quicker, and not unusually it's processed within 7 days post filing. And in closing, just as I've shared with you, the Altasciences Regulatory Affairs is here to assist you should you need our services, and it's quite comprehensive, and we maintain current understanding of the guidances and close contact with Health Canada, as I suggested. We prepare submissions, we monitor and manage them throughout the process. We file IRB submissions. We prepare ECD compliant format documents, and we comply, as I've suggested earlier on, international guidelines, and we have a very active regulatory intelligence within our staff to ensure that we're current with all the receiving authorities' expectations. Consultants have available as needed should there be specific, unique requirements with your filing. At which point that closes my presentation, and I'll open up the forum now for any questions and answers that you may have for both myself and Dr. Setnik. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now begin the question and answer session. If you have a question, please press star, then 1 on your touch-tone phone. If you wish to be removed from the queue, please press the pound sign or the hash key. There will be a delay before the first question is announced. If you are using a speakerphone, you may need to pick up the handset before pressing the numbers. Once again, if you have a question, please press star, then 1 on your touch-tone phone.
Hi, Beatrice. Can you hear me at this point?
Hi, Paul. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Sorry.
Oh,
We've had some technical difficulties, apparently.
Yeah, it seemed like that way. I'm not sure if there are folks on the line, but we do have some questions that came in, and I apologize for that delay. Nobody could hear me.
Right.
There are a few. Why don't we go through the questions if we still have some of our audience on the line?
Sure.
We had a question about elaborating a little bit more on the tax and reimbursement options. And these are available as shred credits, which essentially help the Canada Revenue will reimburse and provide tax credits for companies that are conducting research in Canada that have some kind of a branch or affiliate in Canada. So we can certainly help on a case-by-case basis determine if you are eligible for receiving such credits. It will depend on how your company is organized and whether or not you have a presence in Canada. But there may be ways of exploring this further, and we do have a finance team as well as a regulatory team that can review your particular case and see if you would be eligible. So if you're interested, you have our email addresses here on the Q&A screen. Send us an email and we can further discuss your particular situation and what those tax credits may look like for conducting clinical trial research in Canada. Our next question asks, can we say that for European biotechs or pharmaceuticals, running a trial in Canada can be a good strategy to pave the way to an IND application to FDA without taking the risks of getting refusal or FDA comments that would increase time and cost? Can you comment on this? So this was one of the strategies that we talked about, where sponsors are now more so interested in gaining some clinical data outside of the US before they open that IND. And so there have been situations where you may have a drug molecule, you may have some variability in your preclinical data, and you want to get a better sense of the safety profile and the absorption pharmacokinetics in humans so that you can have a very much more streamlined conversation with the FDA at the time of opening up that IND, and really being able to hone in on what the real risks may be and what that clinical development program may be. As you know, there may be a lot of species inter-individual variation with species, and sometimes your safety profile may not be fully elucidated until you really get to the human clinical trials. And by running those, you may then be able to get a better sense of what your drug safety profile looks like and what kind of studies you may need to further explore during that clinical development path, and get some consensus very early on in that pre-IND meeting as to what areas you may need to explore. When you're running these types of studies and you're running a development path with the FDA, your next real pivotal meeting will be the end of phase 2 meeting. So you could always request ad hoc meetings, but when you have these set milestones, the more information you can bring to the table, the more risk, you're mitigating the risk of uncertainty. You're also providing more data, and being armed with more data is always a good thing for planning purposes. So that is a strategy that we are seeing more and more of, and going outside of the US enables you to independently look at that data. Of course, you do need to have enough preclinical data to be able to design a robust and safe human first-in-human trial. But certainly once you're at that point where you have the preclinical data, that can be a useful strategy. Paul, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's very well put, Beatrice. Exactly right, and that's what I was trying to capture in my presentation, and what you've stated is, in fact, the process in Health Canada is iterative. You're filing per clinical trial, so if you're planning your first-in-human trial in Canada, you would have that data upfront completed, and you could then include that in your IND as a further statement of the safety of the drug, and, as you stated, bolstering any questions or more data on the safety aspects of it. So it does support the IND process, and we are seeing that. It is a good strategy that we've seen clients are taking.
Okay. The next question is, when is the tox data reviewed for the CTA submission? It was mentioned that there was clinical and quality that's reviewed, but the tox data is submitted at the time of the what the CTA asks for is the investigator's brochure, which would include the toxicity data. Paul, did you have anything to add? So that is that is part of the CTA review.
Yeah, that's part of, the CTA, we're focusing primarily on early phase 1 and 2 and so on, and those trials do not require the data, but merely a summary of the tox data that's been available. The agency, if you're filing in Health Canada for the NDS, would expect to see it at that time, but at the CTA or early clinical trial phase, it's not required. So at early stage, unlike an IND filing where you have to submit all aspects of the ICH triangle, the M4, M5 available, you merely provide a summary for CTA. So hopefully that answers the question.
Mm-hmm. And we have a couple of questions around the format of the submission. Are these paper or electronic? And do they need to be submitted? The format of the submission, Paul?
The agency has permitted electronic filing. We prepare them in the ICH format. Altasciences can walk through the specifics on that. And with the pandemic, much more of the communication with the agency is electronic, as many of the reviewers are working from home. So in fact, they prefer electronic correspondence and communication. So.
And the submission itself, can it be paper or electronic or both? Is there a preference?
There's no preference, but electronic is permitted and paper as well.
So if it's electronic, what is the structure and security requirements of the gateway? The gateway is designed to meet the standards of Health Canada and the security of that. I mean, you're submitting the ECTD filing under a secure pipeline, but I'd really like to take that question offline to walk through the specifics of what that questioner is puzzling over, if that's all right. Okay, and we can correspond with the person who wrote that question after these presentation. I'd like to know specifically what their query is on that. And somebody asked about the availability of the slides. Yes, if you send us an email here at the emails here, we can provide you with information. This session was pre-recorded, so we can send you the link as well if you missed out any important details during the discussion. Somebody had commented that they had used Altasciences for a couple of trials and it was a very professional and smooth process. Thank you very much for your comment. We're glad that you had success and that you considered coming to Canada for your clinical trials. Another question came in: what is the timetable for scheduling of meetings with Health Canada? For pre-consultation, there's two paths, as
I alluded in my presentation, if it's a COVID therapy, they're very rapid, and they've detailed that in their interim order. They will offer and provide pre-consultation within a week of your request. And for non-COVID therapies, they are reviewing those therapies and the questions on an ad hoc basis. And depending on the types of questions and the therapy itself, they may decide to work in a less formal fashion through emails and phone, as opposed to a formal pre-consultation. Because of the scheduling challenges in Health Canada, they've had to prioritize the COVID therapy and manage the request for pre-consultation on a review basis.
Okay. What are the typical costs of running a trial relative to the cost in the US? These can vary. There is a favorable exchange rate, certainly for Canada, that does fluctuate from time to time. There can be efficiencies in running the studies in Canada in terms of the accessibility of, for example, subjects. So it really will depend on the type of trial. A typical trial, it's hard to put down a cost for a typical trial because it really is so dependent on the sample size, the duration of the trial, the confinement periods, the required safety assessments. But if you have a particular study in mind and you'd like to get a sense of what the Canadian pricing may look like, please feel free to send us a message here, and we can take a look at your specific trial requirements, and we can see how much it would cost savings could potentially be recognized in Canada. But there are some efficiencies built in, and with the exchange rates that could be favorable for you. The next question, how detailed does the quality summary have to be for Module 2? Paul, is that something that you'd like to address?
Sure. I mean, it's fundamentally a summary of the drug substance and drug product. If you have prepared the basics for your IND, or for EMA, the IMPD, PD, you'll have more than enough information. It's focusing primarily on stability requirements, the basic components of the product itself, and honestly, for a detailed response to that, I'd really like to have that offline as well, because each therapy is unique. So, what would comprise your product? But it is a straightforward summary, and it is detailed in their guidances on quality of overall summaries depending on the therapy type, and we can walk through that with you.
Okay, great. Any CT in clinical trials in Canada presently occurring in collaboration with US on developing a COVID vaccine? So I know that we have been getting quite a few queries around COVID vaccines. We are doing some things on early phase interventions. So there is a lot of work that is advancing. And as Paul had mentioned, the Health Canada has committed for expedited reviews in relation to any therapeutic intervention or vaccines that are being conducted with respect to COVID. So if you are developing something in this area and would like to take advantage of fast tracking in Canada, again, please do reach out to us. That is an active area of research right now. The next question, at the time of CTA filing, how much stability information is needed? Is a commitment sufficient, or is other data required? Paul, if you want to take that one on.
Well, minimum stability, at the time of phase 1 CTA submissions, there should be at least 1 month stability, accelerated long-term of a representative batch. Clinical trial batch should have enough stability to cover the period of the dose administration prior to commencement of the trial.
Okay, is there a minimum amount that would be needed for stability?
It should be at least 1 month when you're making your filing. You must have that stability at the time of filing for the CTA submission for the drug substance.
Okay, great. And do we have to submit a drug substance certificate of analysis at the time of the CTA submission, or can this be submitted during the review period?
I mean, the C of A for clinical trial substances must be included at the time of CTA submission. So the drug product certificate of analysis can be submitted to Health Canada about 15 to 20 days into the CTA review period. And for the bioequivalency studies, it should be available 2 days prior to dose administration.
Mm-hmm. And when should the simplified quality overall summary template be used versus a phase 1 QoS template? So Paul, if you can kind of walk us through what those templates look like and what's used.
Yeah, I mean, there's many, there's various templates depending on the therapy and or the filing process that you're going through. If it's a standard BE, you'll use a simplified QoS template, whereas for a standard phase 1 that's a little bit more complex or complex bioequivalency study, you'd use a phase 1 template.
And Paul, this is something we help virtually all of our sponsors. I think there's only a few exceptions where sponsors will handle the CTA themselves. So we routinely do this in support of any clinical trials that we initiate in Canada. Can you sort of walk us high level through the process? If you have a sponsor coming in with a clinical trial for the very first time, they're unfamiliar with the CTA process. Can you kind of walk us through how our regulatory groups will help to spearhead the whole CTA process for the client, and sort of what the expectations are, what the client needs to provide, what that timeline looks like, and virtually, I mean, all of these templates and these submission processes are done internally at Altasciences on behalf of sponsors. But perhaps you can just kind of walk us through of what to expect and what happens during that CTA compilation and submission process.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I mean, essentially the team here has, by virtue of the slides you've seen, filed many of these submissions, and as a result of our interactions with the sponsors, we've got various checklists and guidance documents that we can forward on to our clients that we've distilled from the Health Canada publications. If you're familiar with the ICH Module 1 and 2, you've made filings in other countries, this process will be very familiar to you, and is only minor differences will be noted with respect to what the agency will need, and we're happy to walk through that. But if you've made your filing with IAN for the FDA, or you made your filing for the EMA, it's almost a cut and paste into a lot of the documents that would be required. The standard module would be to include a cover letter of what the submission is. The next aspect of the Module 1 would be just a summary, or what we call an application form 3011. That's prepared and signed off on behalf of the sponsor. We would detail in another component part of the module the clinical trial application information. We list also an attestation of compliance, the clinical trial site information form we would generate on behalf of the client. There's an investigational brochure that would be required to be submitted, or if it's a bioequivalence, it would be the product monograph that you're assessing. Obviously, you would generate a clinical trial protocol, and that would be submitted, and you would include the informed consent documents. Module 2 would provide, as I suggested, just a quality summary with the associated required certificate of analyses and stability data to provide the quality division of the Office of Clinical Trials the information they're required for submissions. So that's very, very high level. I'm just skimming over the details, and it's obviously per trial type and per therapy type, but that's essentially what's been done. And so we, because of our years of experience on this, as I suggested, we have checklists that we can provide you, guidance documents, and we set up calls throughout this process so that if there's any questions that you have, either generating the data for us or information with regards to the QOS or Module 1 documents required, we're more than happy to walk you through that process.
Thank you, Paul. We have another few more questions that I'd like to get to before we hit the end of the hour. One question, has Altasciences had experience in applying and successfully receiving a cannabis research license in the past year or so? The answer to that is yes, and we have been doing quite a lot of cannabis research at our sites. In fact, our sites are specialized for CNS drug evaluation, including cannabis, as well as smoking chambers. So we've been evaluating a variety of different vaping devices, different administration methods that require contained smoking rooms for cannabis research. So yes, we do have a lot of licenses. And on that regard, we also have the licenses to hold controlled substances, including cannabis, but including other controlled substances. This is also often a question that comes up with regards to some of our sponsors in the US with imports and exports of controlled substances, which we then file for the import and export licenses. And we have the documentation and licensing on site in our pharmacy to receive and to hold controlled substances on site. And this is something that we routinely do because our site specializes in CNS research, and it is very frequent that we have scheduled substances. We also will source scheduled substances locally when you need them for positive controls. So those are, that makes it a simplified process, not requiring shipment. So again, a case-by-case basis, but yes, we are conducting an ample amount of cannabis research.
That's a great comment, Beatrice, about the pharmacy group, and I think that highlights really the overall culture and philosophy about the support that we provide the sponsor. We put each expert team in touch with your group as required so that you get the full access to all the expertise that we have. So I've talked about the regulatory affairs. Clearly, Beatrice, your expertise in design and overall aspects of a clinical trial is at the beck and call of our clients, but equally so for pharmacy, import, export. There's a real team here looking to support that effort. I would like to just add one comment too. The specifics about the electronic filing for the CTA, the Health Canada uses DocuBridge as their primary secure filing.
Okay,
Sorry,
great. Thank you for that. Another question.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, Paul. Did you want to add something?
No, that's fine. I apologize. I talked over you.
Oh, that's okay. Another question was about offering service and creating SOPs sponsors must have in place for clinical trials. So the SOPs needed for clinical trials, our site has all of the necessary SOPs for conducting the clinical trial from start to finish because we are responsible for virtually everything involved with the protocol development, all the way through study conduct, through data management, through statistics, all the way to the generation of the clinical study report. And all of those areas have specific standard operating procedures, SOPs, that govern the processes involved, from everything, including the reviews of protocols, the administration of safety examinations, the interpretation of lab results. These are all outlined in our SOPs. So when a sponsor comes to us, we would be deferring to our SOPs for our clinical trials. In some cases, a sponsor may have a specific SOP that they would like to implement, so we do work closely with the sponsors, but we do have those in place. And there are times where we have to create a unique SOP or an operating procedure for a unique procedure or something like that. So we can certainly assist in creating any novel SOPs that would be required for some unique attribute of a clinical trial. But all of the standard SOPs are in place. And Paul, in our last minute, and I'm afraid we'll probably have to get back to the gentleman who asked about the SHRED program, the possibility of how much it is, the percentage-wise of the taxation and the timeframes and things like that. And I think that we can follow with that up with the audience through our finance group that can provide more details in terms of the legalities of the entities, how to establish SHRED credits, and what that looks like in terms of the eligibility and the amount getting back during the filings. So we will provide more of those details, as I'm afraid we're out of time. But I would just like to say thank you very much for joining today. It was a pleasure. Paul and I had a lot of pleasure speaking to you today about conducting clinical trials in Canada. Please, if you do have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We can provide you with the presentation and additional information specific to your programs and specific to your organizational business unit as to SHRED eligibility, amongst other items that you may have specific for your particular research program, your company, and your needs. So thank you very much for joining today.
Yes, thank you. I echo your comment, and as you mentioned, if you have questions that we didn't get to, or think of ones following the lecture or upon review of the PowerPoint, don't hesitate to reach out. We're more than happy to answer the questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This concludes today's conference. Thank you for participating. You may now disconnect. Speakers, please stand by for your post-conference.